All right, I want to once again welcome everyone to this month's Wildlife for Lunch webinar. This month's webinar is on pond and lake management. It's going to be presented by Dr. Billy Higginbotham. He's a professor in Extension, Wildlife, and Fishery Specialist with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension. Today's webinar is made possible through funding provided by the San Antonio Livestock Exposition Incorporated, and it's hosted by the Texas Wildlife Association and Texas A&M AgriLife Extension. With that, Dr. Higginbotham, I will pass the controls over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Clint, and welcome everyone. We appreciate you spending your lunch hour with us today. What we want to do is talk about that pond resource there on your farm or ranch and kind of give you some ideas on where you can go from here to provide better fishing for your family and friends on that body of water. So I want to try to give you some tips that you can take back home with you after today, and that's a much better alternative than you pulling your hair out. There are several things that are of interest here in Texas regarding our private impoundments. We've got about 1.2 million private impoundments that cover about 500,000 surface acres. And something that I want to reiterate throughout the talk is good fishing is the byproduct of one thing, and that is good fish populations. Now, I don't necessarily mean large fish populations, but well-balanced fish populations between predator and prey species, as well as balanced fish populations with the habitat that they occur in. And what we're going to try to do is emphasize some things that can what I call shorten the time between bites, which is my definition of fisheries management. Now, we've got lots of opportunity because 95% of this 1.2 million ponds are not managed anywhere near their production potential. Now, what do I mean by that production potential? Well, these smaller ponds, less than 1 surface acre in size, are easily capable of producing 1,000 pounds of edible sized catfish per surface acre per year. Or if it's a larger impoundment, say a 1 surface acre pond or larger that we typically manage for largemouth bass, we could possibly produce as many as 30 to 50 pounds of largemouth bass per surface acre per year. Now, that's fairly intensive management on both counts. And the nice thing about it is we can continue to use these impoundments for perhaps our primary goal, and that is for livestock watering, or perhaps you're also using that as a source of irrigation. But there's some questions in need of answers that I can't answer for you. You have to think about yourself. And first and foremost, what are your goals? Are you trying to provide an all-around fishery for multiple species? Are you trying to grow the next state record largemouth bass? You need to stop and think about what you really want out of that impoundment. And then you have to look at your resources, and by resources I mean the physical resources, the pond itself, as well as your physical resources. How much are you willing to invest dollar-wise into improving fishing in that body of water? If there's limitations there, can we overcome them and help you reach your goals? And so that's certainly an important consideration. Sometimes we can, sometimes we cannot. Most of us are going to be dealing with existing ponds. You know, occasionally we have new impoundments constructed and we get to stock those ponds from scratch. That's a great situation, but typically we've already got the ponds, we've already got fish populations present. They were probably built for another purpose initially, and then fishing and stocking fish was somewhat of an afterthought. So what can we expect from these existing ponds? Well, there's some interesting characteristics that we need to look at in terms of many of these ponds are older. And as you can see over time, there may need to be some maintenance conducted to keep those ponds intact. Here you see a low place in the center of the dam. That's not where the spillway is, and the next rain that occurs will typically push that pond over the dam right in the middle of that structure and could cause some integrity issues that could result in losing the entire dam. So we have to maintain these ponds physically to keep them productive to where they hold water. Something else we see quite often is where landowners allow trees to go on the front, top, and back of the dams, and this is a no-no. If you've got smaller trees, you want to go ahead and remove those, say less than 6 inches in diameter. If you've got large mature trees, well, you might as well go ahead and leave them, because if you remove them, the roots may rot and form passages where water can follow. If you leave them, you may also have some integrity issues with the dam. But we do want grass cover on the dam, but we do not want tree cover on the dam. So if you're at the point where you can prevent these trees from reaching a larger size and can get rid of them fairly early in their growth stage, go ahead and do that, because again, they can cause integrity issues to that dam. Obviously, in this situation, it's primarily a livestock watering pond, but you can see the erosion that's occurred. So this may be a situation where if fish populations are important in that pond, and yes, we can grow catfish in water that color, but you may want to fence access off because of the erosion occurring to the dam structure itself. There's some critters out there that can kind of aid in our dam and the integrity of those dams issues. One is a nutria, probably not as damaging as the next critter, but certainly capable of burrowing. And of course, anytime we have beavers show up in our ponds, it's typically going to be a situation we're going to want to control those beavers, because they're going to either try to block the spillway or build a lodge into the dam structure itself. Again, not a good situation for pond or impoundment health over the long term. You know, we can have a nice pond like this. You can see the dam in the background, it's full, but when we have these integrity issues, unfortunately, we can see this happen, and either due to heavy rain or integrity issues of that dam, the dam blows out, and we lose not only the water, but we lose our fish population as well. Now, pond size is a critical consideration as we manage these ponds, so I would advise you the first cut is to determine the surface area in acres of your pond. That's the metric we use to stock ponds, the metric we use for several different considerations, but you need to know the surface area in acres. So step that pond off, measure it. There's 43,560 square feet in an acre. So a good starting point is to look at the surface area in acres. Now let's talk about some management that applies to all ponds, regardless of whether they're less than an acre or larger than an acre. We've talked a little bit about some unwanted guests from a dam integrity standpoint. These are the only two animals that I feel can have a real impact on fish populations. They're the river otter on the left, and we've seen a giant increase in their populations in East Texas over the last several years. And then on the right, the double-crested cormorant, what many people call a water turkey, that migrate down from the Great Lakes Midwestern region during the winter months and spend their winters fishing on our ponds and lakes. And in some of our private waters, if you have enough of those double-crested cormorants stay for 3 or 4 months, they can have some pretty good impacts on your fish populations. There is a procedure that you can go through that you can legally control both of these particular animals that can have negative impacts. Any other species out there, great blue herons, kingfishers, some of these other species of birds, turtles, have negligible impacts on your fish populations. Let's start with water quality, and certainly that's part of the habitat of your pond is the water. So certainly we need enough water to be able to raise fish in, but we need to look at the quality of that water. And particularly in East Texas, where we have acid soils, we tend to have lower pH water because of the acidity of the soils in the watershed. And so this is something we may have to address through adding bulk lime, which you can see being done here. As you move west of I-35 and certainly south of I-10, this is not going to be much of an issue. And if your county doesn't have acidic soils, if there's not a liming service for pastures and hay meadows in your counties, chances are this is not something that you need to be concerned about. But we do have to lime our East Texas waters quite often to bring the pH and total alkalinity up to levels that are conducive for raising fish. Another consideration of water chemistry and water quality is clarity. Now, we don't need a clear pond to raise all species of fish, but if our primary goal is to raise largemouth bass, they are sight-feeding predators, and we need 18 to 24 inches of visibility into that water column throughout most of the year. If we don't have that, what is the cause of that lack of water clarity? Is it a muddy or turbid condition? Maybe it's just got a very heavy algal bloom, a very rich green color to it that's limiting visibility. Now, we don't want crystal clear water in our farm ponds that we're managing for fish. Clear water is unproductive water. And so we want to have enough of an algal bloom in those bodies of water so we have an active food chain. But super clear water is also super unproductive water, and that leads to some other problems such as aquatic vegetation issues. Here's a situation where they've done road construction adjacent to a private lake, and they've tried to control that erosion, but as you can see, the water is still somewhat of a muddy color. This wouldn't be a good long-term situation if that pond owner is managing for bass. But so if you have these type of situations where you're going to be working in the watershed, you may want to consider putting up some sort of filter or buffer that will protect that pond resource. Keep in mind one thing: the healthier the watershed is of that pond, better vegetated, not overgrazed, not eroded, the better health that pond will have as well. So that watershed activity often impacts the health of that pond in terms of water quality. So they go together, they're linked, and you need to manage that watershed right along with that pond itself. Now here's a situation where a pond was built, it remained muddy, they stocked it with largemouth bass and forage, but took no steps to try to remediate this muddy condition, and so their bass population suffered for several years as a result of lack of visibility. So should that pond be cleared? Well, not necessarily. If it's a small pond that you're going to manage, say for catfish that'll be on a pelleted ration, I prefer that muddy color to the water. It limits submerged weed species growing because of no light penetration into the water column. And the fish aren't going to taste muddy because you're going to have them on a supplemental ration. But if it is a pond, typically 1 acre or larger, that you're going to manage for largemouth bass, you do need that 18 to 24 inches of water clarity. So determine if colloidal clay is the culprit in making that larger pond muddy that you may want to clear. Look at your watershed. If there's erosion in that watershed, certainly treating the pond will do no good unless you address the watershed issues first. Otherwise, the next rain, you'll just have more clay into the pond because of that erosion that's going on. And then if it is colloidal clay, then you can take steps to clear that pond by adding a coagulant. And there's a number of them out there, but typically the two products that we use most often are either gypsum, which is calcium sulfate, or alum, which is aluminum sulfate. And so we can clear those ponds to the point to where bass can see in order to make a living. Another characteristic of a well-designed farm or ranch impoundment is to have a bottom release drain pipe at the deepest point in that pond. Most of our ponds don't have this feature, but I can tell you that it is well worth the effort to install one in a new impoundment, and there are some designs that the Natural Resources Conservation Service has that will allow you to install a bottom release drain pipe into an existing pond without having to drain the pond. Now, why is this bottom release feature important? Well, the worst quality water in your farm pond is on the bottom, in the deepest point. So as we get rainfall and we have excess water leaving that pond, rather than it leaving around the spillway, that top several feet of water, which is your best quality water, we allow the drain pipe to remove that excess water off the bottom. If you can remove that dead water off the bottom that's lower in oxygen and normally high in organic matter, then we've improved water quality, and by improving water quality, we can increase the carrying capacity of that pond to support fish. Here's another example. This is behind the dam of a bass lake. In this case, the lake level is controlled by the height of that standpipe, and whenever the lake level exceeds the height of the standpipe, it starts flowing, but the water's being removed off the pond bottom. Now, you still need your spillway around one side of the dam or the other during those particularly heavy rains. For example, what Houston has experienced earlier this week, you want that spillway to kick in because you don't ever want the dam breached by the water. Again, that can damage that structure. So where you can include this bottom release drain feature, it will improve water quality and will allow you to have a higher carrying capacity, that is, raise more pounds of fish in the same amount of water. Here's the spillway that you still need. This particular lake also has a bottom release drain pipe, so you want the bottom release drain pipe to kick in and remove water first. Then you want the emergency spillway to take over any excess flow that the bottom release drain pipe can't handle. That way you don't run into any issues of breaching the dam. Now let's start first with our smaller ponds. Again, those less than 1 surface acre, or really any pond that's at least that has a muddy condition that you're not able to clear for whatever reason. The first thing I'd like for you to do is think about what fish species already inhabit that small pond. And many of those species could be predators or competitors for the targeted fish that you're going to try to raise. So you need to think about those. They could be bullheads. This is a swarm of bullhead fry. Mudcats, some people call them, that have hatched in the pond, and they're going to compete with your targeted catfish species, blue or channel catfish in most cases, for the supplemental ration that you may feed, and so that in that case they would be a competitor for food. Crappie, typically we don't manage ponds for crappie until they reach at least 10 surface acres in size. These happen to be 3-year-old crappie, and you can see they're not even the size of a dollar bill. Crappie are very prolific. They can overpopulate and stunt very easily, so we do not certainly want to have them in our small ponds. Maybe if you get overflow from a river or public lake, there could be gar, which could be a predator upon your targeted fish that you're going to produce. We have other species. We have carp. We have buffalo. Occasionally, folks will catch some yellowcat, ops, flatheads, same name for the fish that you see here, to maybe try to get rid of some trash fish out of their pond. And they'll do that. They're a tremendous predator, but they'll also eat your targeted fish species, in this case, a channel or blue catfish. So we want to avoid having them in these small ponds as well. Warmouth. This is a species of fish that will compete for food and feed on small fish there in the pond. Not exactly one that we worry about, but when they show up, it certainly is not one that we manage for. Same can be said for green sunfish. They'll compete with your catfish for that supplemental ration. Again, and they'll feed on smaller fish in the pond, typically not an issue in a catfish pond, but again, they occupy space that could be taken by your catfish species that are targeted for production. So if we have any and all of these what I'll call non-targeted fish species already in that small pond, perhaps the best thing we can do is go in there in June as our water temperatures warm to 70 degrees or higher, and go in and rotenone that pond and kill all the existing fish out and get a fresh start. Now, one thing you need to think about is what is above your pond. If you have a pond immediately above your pond in the watershed and it also has these trash fish, typically when it overflows due to heavy rain, those species are going to be able to move down into your pond. The same thing can happen from below your pond in the watershed, from a creek, from another pond. Those fish can move back up unless you have a spillway that drops off sharply for about 3 feet vertical fall, or you've got water leaving via that bottom release drain pipe. If it's just a real gentle flow, as you saw down that slope beside the dam on a previous slide, those fish can move. Once you connect one pond to the next, above or below, those fish can move from one body of water to the other. So think about what's going on in those other ponds if they also occur in that watershed. But you may want to go in, kill those ponds out, remove the existing fish populations, and we use rotenone. And rotenone comes in a gallon formulation. We use about a gallon per acre foot of water. And then you need to wait 2 to 3 weeks for that rotenone to dissipate before you stock. So if you're able to rotenone in early June, you still have time to buy your fish in late June and get your pond stocked where you can get your fish population up and going during the 2016 growing season. The other nice thing about rotenone is if you're watering livestock from that pond, you don't have to move them to another pasture. They can continue to use that water. Just a shot of a gallon can of rotenone. Typically, we mix the rotenone with water. It can be sprayed in. It can be poured into the prop wash of a small engine. And typically, the fish will start surfacing within about a half hour. The most difficult to kill species, such as bullheads and maybe some of the rough fish species like gar, they may take longer, but typically fish will start dying within about 30 minutes. There's no need for you to try to dip these fish and put them in fresh water and move them and stock them in another tank. If they're stressed to the point in June and that you can dip them, they're probably not going to make it. And by law, we cannot recommend that you consume any fish from a pond that has received a rotenone treatment. So once we have that small pond cleaned out, or if it happened to be a new pond that you built, here's our stocking rates for our channel or blue catfish, or a combination of the two can be used. If you're going to stock those fish and walk away and do nothing, your maximum stocking rate is 100 fish per surface acre. However, if you're going to supplement those fish with a floating catfish ration and either use an automatic feeder or hand feed 6 to 7 days a week, because of that supplementation strategy, you're able to stock up to 1,000 per surface acre. In other words, a 10-fold increase over doing nothing. Now you may say, well, I don't need 1,000 fish per surface acre. I can't eat that many catfish. Well, that's fine. You can stock a lesser stocking rate, but to maximize growth of these fish, that regular feeding program is the best way to go. I'll give you an example. You can stock a 6-inch channel catfish fingerling this time of year, put it on a floating catfish ration that contains at least 28% crude protein, feed those fish regularly, and those fish will put on at least a pound of weight gain by the onset of cool weather in October, November. So that is a very efficient use of that feed. It'll typically take 1.5 pounds to 2 pounds of feed to put on a pound of weight gain. So the point is you can go from a 6-inch fingerling now to an edible size fish by the onset of cool weather. We want to stick with a floating feed. We want to give those fish all they'll eat in about 10 or 15 minutes. And if we can feed on a regular basis, either through an automatic feeder or by hand feeding, 6, maybe 7 days a week from now until cool weather, then those fish should easily put on a pound of weight gain. So it's a very effective use of these smaller ponds in terms of production potential. If you're in a real windy area, say out west of I-35 or in the southern part of the state where you get a lot of wind, then what you may want to do is build you a feeding ring out of PVC or out of boards that you can place out there and anchor in about 4 or 5 feet of water. Train the fish to come to one location, feed there, and then the fish will be trained to come up inside of that structure and eat the feed, and that way they don't have to chase it down the pond if it happens to be a very windy day. Now, if we stock heavy and we feed heavy, then the moral of the story is we've got to be prepared to take at least part of those fish out of that pond. And many of our small ponds are seineable, so you could go in and seine the entire crop in the fall at the end of the growing season and take out some of those fish. Or if you want to use hook and line, certainly you can do that. But there is a limit to the pounds of fish that we want to carry over into that next growing season. So if we stocked at 1,000 per surface acre, fed those fish very regularly, then we're looking at 1,000 pounds of fish plus per surface acre at the end of that first growing season. So it's quite a population. So what we want to do is make sure we don't exceed that 1,000 pounds per acre level of production as we carry those fish into next summer. We can get through the winter just fine. The water's cool, oxygen levels are high, but come next June, as that water warms up, those fish are going to be actively growing again, and if we don't take enough out and we exceed this 1,000 pound per acre carrying capacity recommendation, we could get into a situation of low oxygen during the summer months. The warmer water holds less oxygen than the cooler water does in the winter, and you'll see those fish piping at the surface. This is where the oxygen level is highest during an oxygen depletion event, right at that air-water interface. And when you see this, it's not a good sign. So the best way to avoid an oxygen depletion is to make sure, if you carry those fish over from that small pond into the next growing season, make sure you're not carrying any more than 1,000 pounds of fish, preferably fewer, because you've got to allow for their growth through that summer. But get that fish population weight down if you stock heavy and feed heavy. If you get a situation where you've got to do aeration, you've got those fish coming up, you have to act quickly to keep from losing them, then just about everybody can get hold of a boat and motor and crank that motor, put it in gear, nose it against the bank or a dock, and let that energy from that propeller circulate the water in the pond and bring more of it in contact with the air, and that will increase the oxygen content and perhaps buy you some time to find out what's going on with that oxygen level. If you fail to react, then certainly you can see this situation. This was a 10th acre pond. It had 800 pounds of catfish when the oxygen depletion occurred. That's the equivalent of 8,000 pounds of fish per surface acre. That's more like the level of production we see in commercial aquaculture, where commercial producers are raising catfish in specially designed ponds, exchanging water, aerating. And so this was going to catch up to this pond owner sooner or later. And so the moral of the story is, if you stock heavy and feed heavy, you've got to take some fish out. You don't want to try to carry more than 1,000 pounds of fish total per surface acre during the warm months. So the bottom line, go fishing, get out the seine, whatever you need to do to fish that population down, which is the whole reason for stocking it in the first place. And have some family fish fries as a reward for your hard work of producing those catfish. Now, let's change gears and talk about ponds that we're going to stock as new ponds, or ponds that have been renovated, no fish populations present. We don't often rotenome ponds over an acre in size and start from scratch. It does happen occasionally, but I just wanted to give you a feel for what the stocking strategies were for a new or existing pond with no fish populations present. You see that we start with a forage base, and the key to that forage base is bluegill. Now, in next month's issue of Texas Wildlife Magazine, there'll be an article that I wrote about bluegill, so you can read more if you're a member of Texas Wildlife Association, and hopefully you are, about this particular species and the role it plays in largemouth bass management. Here in East Texas, we'll supplement the bluegill with red ear. We'll also stock fathead minnows. This will be for first-year growth on your bass fingerlings. And then the next spring, we'll stock our bass fingerlings. Depending on what your management goal may be, we'll either stock Florida, the F1, which is a cross between the Florida and the Northern, or the Northern. Most landowners opt for the Florida or the F1 because with that Florida gene present, you're capable of growing a larger size bass with that Florida gene in your bass population. And then you notice it's okay, even though you may be managing primarily for bass, it's okay to stock catfish and have channel or blue catfish, or a combination of the two, in that bass, bluegill, red ear, fathead minnow pond. No problem with doing that, but notice we've backed way off the stocking rate than what we would use if we just stocked catfish by themselves. Now, the other option from the fall spring stocking strategy is to stock everything together in a new pond or an existing pond that contains no fish. And the main difference you see here is we have to stock larger bluegill, and if you're going to stock red ear, primarily in East Texas we use the red ear, you would stock larger bluegill and red ear. That way those fish can go ahead and start spawning the first summer they're in the pond. So it's a little different strategy, but typically we'll stock the forage in the fall, followed by the bass the next spring, but you've got the option to stock everything together here over the next several months before warm weather shuts the fish farms down, typically sometime the end of June, early July. Now, if you're going to fertilize your pond, and I hope you will, that you can double your stocking rates because you automatically double the carrying capacity per surface acre for your pond if you can fertilize that pond. And if you'll look back at the March issue of the Texas Wildlife magazine, I wrote an article on pond fertilization there, and you can look at all the particulars of how to fertilize a pond properly. So let's switch now. We're talking about bass management, these larger ponds that are at least a surface acre in size with at least that 15, 18, 24 inches of visibility. Typically, if you run your arm down into the water column to your elbow and wiggle the tips of your fingers, if you can see the tips of your fingers moving, then you've got enough visibility to successfully manage that pond for largemouth bass. There's assessments that have to be made on these existing lakes, and again, that's what most of you will have. Maybe you bought the place and fish were already stocked, or it's been in the family for generations and you really don't know what the stocking history is, but we've got to go in and make some assessments to determine what we want to do in terms of management. First off is the user group. You know, what do the anglers, what do the landowner want from that pond in terms of fishing quality? We have to assess the habitat, and we've talked about that. We've talked about the pond itself, the surface area of the pond, the quality of the water. Habitat also includes things like aquatic vegetation. And then lastly, we need to think about the assessment of the existing fish population. Now, way too often we want to jump and just look at the fish population without taking in the considerations for the user group and habitat. And that's a mistake. We need to do those first and then look at the fish population. But, you know, it's a simple question when you assess the user group. What do you want from that pond? Your expectations have to be both reasonable and achievable. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, let's say your goal is to have lots of big crappie in your 1 acre pond. Well, that's the goal of everyone. Unfortunately, as for reasons I've discussed, that's really an unreasonable and unachievable goal. So the manager of that pond needs to reassess what the goals are and make sure they're realistic with the resource. Now, I want trophy bass. Well, perhaps if you've got a pond that's got enough surface area and the right degree of water clarity, the right water quality, the right forage base, then perhaps this is reasonable and achievable. So let's then look at the habitat assessment. We talked about the physical attributes of the body of water, the surface area in acres, but also water quality, having that pH and total alkalinity in the right range. You know, what are the oxygen levels? Typically, the lakes will be able to maintain sufficient oxygen levels above 5 parts per million to support fish populations throughout the year. And then aquatic vegetation, and this is the most common question we receive in extension from pond owners, is dealing with aquatic vegetation where it limits the use of that body of water, and there is a need to control some or all of that vegetation based on pond owner goals. Looking at the water quality, again, nutrient loads. This would be something that could enter from the watershed. So looking at the uses of that watershed, perhaps there's a large population of cattle that are penned above that pond. Well, obviously there's going to be some nutrient loading as a result of that. As we move into out of East Texas, we have some issues with golden algae. As we get into the more saline, higher pH waters, we've had some unfortunate fish kills on well-managed private bodies of water as a result of toxins produced by golden algae. And then we talked about the visibility, the need to have some degree of water clarity to manage for bass. Now here's a perfect situation. This was a nice bass lake. The landowner had an opportunity to sell the gravel adjacent to and in the watershed of this pond. They moved the topsoil aside. You see the mound in the background. They harvested the gravel and sold it. And as soon as it started raining, this eroded watershed started washing into the pond, turned the pond a muddy color. I took this photograph over 30 years ago. You can drive by this body of water today, and it's still as muddy today as it was then. And then aquatic vegetation, I talked about the potential for interfering with the landowner's use of that body of water, whether it's for irrigation, livestock water, or in today's case, fish. It depends on the species, it depends on the coverage, but that aquatic plant becomes an aquatic weed anytime it interferes with the landowner's use of that body of water for their intended goals. Now, from a bass management standpoint, having some degree of aquatic vegetation in that pond is probably a plus because it provides habitat for those young bass. It also harbors a lot of food organisms that those bass and other fingerling fish, say your forage species, can use. But we don't want to have too much of it. We can have too much of a good thing. But if we can manage where we don't have more than a quarter to perhaps as high as a third of the surface area covered in aquatic vegetation in a bass lake, it's probably providing benefits. The problem is aquatic vegetation seldom knows when to quit growing, and so we can get excessive coverage, and that can provide too much cover for the forage fish present, and we can end up with a skinny bass population because even if with an abundant forage fish population present, there's so much escape cover by excessive vegetation, they're just not able to use it properly. If you have aquatic vegetation you need to control, go to AQUAPLANT. This is our aquatic plant website, aquaplant.tamu.edu. It will help you diagnose the identity of your weed species, which is key. And once you have identity in hand, you can go to management options and look at the mechanical, biological, and chemical controls that are recommended for that particular species of plant. But key in controlling aquatic vegetation is proper identification. We have lots and lots of good color photographs and line drawings of these different plant species that occur in Texas private impoundments. Dr. Michael Master did a fantastic job of putting this website together, and so I recommend it highly to you as a resource in the future anytime you have aquatic plant issues that may be in need of control. Now lastly, after we've assessed the user group, we've assessed the situation with the habitat, now we can begin looking at the existing fish population present in that particular body of water. And so we're interested in the sport fish. Those are typically the species that we're fishing for. Certainly we have to be aware of the forage fish population that allows us to have a balanced sport fish population. And then if we have some rough fish issues, we may have to address those as well. I'm always amazed when I visit some of these private club lakes here in East Texas. There's always a set of recommendations tacked up on a tree or tacked up on the boat launch at the ramp that they've come up with some recommendations, and I always quiz the members, well, how did you come up with that regulation? And everybody immediately looks down at their boots and starts kicking gravel there in the parking lot because nobody can answer the question. You know, perhaps it's what some nearby public lake, what their regulations are, or perhaps it's what another club lake is using down the road for regulations. But the point I'm trying to make is you need to tailor your fish harvest regulations on your particular body of water based on your fish populations inherent in that body of water. So they need to be tailored to your fish population, not what your neighbor's doing, not what might be in force on another body of water on your place, but tailor those fish harvest regulations to your fish populations. And I'm going to proceed to give you the tools that you can have a couple of options to do that. So, you know, you go out and you go fishing and you catch some, in this case, bass. Well, so what? Is that good? Is that bad? Is my fish population healthy? Well, certainly we can kind of just use our eye and look at our bass that we catch that are typically at the top of the food chain in our private impoundments. And, you know, if they're in good health, then chances are we've got good habitat, we've got good forage populations. And so that's kind of an indicator of the status that we're in, if those fish look like they're fairly robust and healthy. Now, many of you have caught bass in ponds that basically look like a snake with fins that are in very poor condition, and that's an indicator too that you may have habitat and or forage problems. So let's look at this a little bit closer. How are you going to assess that existing fish population? Well, I liken it to whether you're going to buy a Volkswagen or a Corvette. Now, with some of the problems Volkswagen's experienced recently with their mileage ratings, may have to find another car to use as an example. But the Corvette approach would be that you hire a professional consultant, and there are a number of professional fisheries biologists that work on private water in the state of Texas. They can come in and assess your user group, habitat, and fish population in a fairly short period of time. The results of their analysis should result in a written set of prioritized management recommendations with estimated costs of each of those recommendations for you to put into place for that body of water. Now, like a Corvette, it comes at a cost. The sticker price is going to be higher than what you're going to pay for that Volkswagen, but depending on your goals and depending on your situation, going that route may well be worth it to you. So I want you to be aware that that option is out there and available. Now, the Volkswagen or do-it-yourself approach is a little bit different. We're going to rely on information that the anglers and the pond owner or lake owner gather themselves. And so chief among that information, those data that will be collected, will be to keep catch records. And this is just simply recording the numbers and total lengths of all fish caught by species. If I had a private pond out there and I was allowing other people to fish, the one mandatory regulation there would be is they write down those species, the number they caught, the lengths of each of those fish they caught on a log that you maintain there at the lake, and I would make that mandatory for anyone that had permission to fish that body of water. It doesn't cost you a thing. The other thing that we're going to do for managing our existing bass lake is starting in June, I want you to go purchase about a $15, $20 Minocane and take some drags through shallow water. The reason I'm wanting you to wait until June is that will give time for bluegill to start spawning. They'll start spawning next month in May, but they'll be large enough to pick up in that seine beginning in June. So you can go in June and July, and you're looking at young of the year presence of not only bluegill, but bass, which are spawning now in our private impoundments. And so we're just trying to determine if reproduction between these two key species is ongoing. And it tells us if we've got reproduction that we've also got adults. It also tells us that our habitat's in good enough shape that we can have successful reproduction. Because if you're managing your pond properly, there should be no reason to have to go in and restock bass and bluegill on a reoccurring basis. In fact, about the only reason that we would ever restock bass would be to go in and introduce Florida bass in an existing bass population that did not contain the Florida gene in order to introduce that Florida gene into that population so we have the opportunity to grow larger bass over time, provided the habitat, the forage is in good condition. So the key relationship in a bass lake is the relationship between bass and their primary forage species, the bluegill. So one thing I want you to do when you get home away from the computer is to go out and verify that you've got bluegill as a forage fish in your bass lake. And there's 4 characteristics I want you to look for. They've got a fairly small mouth. They've got a black or a blue ear flap. They have several of these vertical bars running up and down their sides. And then if you hold that dorsal fin up, that top fin up to the light, to the sky, you'll notice a black or blue ink blotch at the rear of that dorsal fin. Now, you can tell these 4 characteristics on a bluegill the size of your thumbnail, or you can tell them on the size of a bluegill 12 inches long. But if you've got sunfish in your pond that meet these 4 characteristics, then you've got the primary forage for your largemouth bass population present, and there normally is no reason to go in and stock more of them. So go in, take these shallow seine hauls once you've verified you've got bluegill, and basically all you're looking for is young of the year bass. They're about a 2 or 3 inch long bass, and you should have bass of several different sizes present in the fingerling stage, because you'll have multiple spawns, typically from March well into May, sometimes from the same female bass. And then you should have multiple sizes of young of the year bluegill, as you see there present, and that tells you you've got both species and they are able to reproduce successfully. Okay. We've got some support material that Clint's going to make available. I don't want to spend much time on these tables, but basically with your seine, you see there under seine contents in the first box, you want young bass present and many recently hatched bluegills, and you're going to continue your assessment over under the recommendation side of looking at what harvest regulations should accompany a population balance between bass and bluegill. So something very easy to do yourself, and well worth the time. You can get the kids and grandkids out there and let them get muddy and wet with that seine in June, July, looking for young of the year bass and bluegill. Now, the other do-it-yourself component is going to be, as I mentioned, your angler catch records. And the beauty of angler catch records is they cost you nothing. It's just a matter of collecting a little bit of data while fishing. But we're going to go about this in such a way that we're sampling our fish population. We're not just fishing, we're sampling all sizes of the bass that are present. So we're going to use various size lures to target different size ranges of largemouth bass that may be present in your particular impoundment. We want to fish small bass lures, medium-sized lures, and larger lures to sample small, medium, and large bass that may be present. We want to fish all these techniques the same amount of time, and we want to catch at least 20 bass 8 inches or larger before we start trying to draw any conclusions from our fishing. Fish all over the pond. This is something, it may take you 2 fishing trips to catch 20 fish. It may take you 5 fishing trips. The more fish you catch, the better picture it paints of what your bass population looks like. But again, we don't want to bias our harvest by just using one particular lure and fishing all the time. At the same time, we're going to go in and we're going to take a look at our bluegill size structure, and we're going to go in and try to catch some bluegill using some sort of artificial bait, or perhaps worms or crickets, whatever, and try to collect at least 100 sunfish, and hopefully most of those sunfish you catch will be bluegill. Fishing all over the pond just like we would for bass. And then what we're going to do is we're going to determine the percentage of bass that you caught in your sample that are at least 12 inches long. You see this formula on the screen? That's all we're trying to determine is, okay, of the number of bass you caught through this scientific angling, what percentage of those bass were 12 inches or larger in size? So here's our example. We went to Pine Bur, we caught 100 bass, 45 were at least 12 inches long, so we had a percentage size distribution of 45, okay? Pretty easy math. Now we're going to go back and we're going to look at the number of bluegill that we caught, but we want to know what proportion or what percentage of the bluegill we caught were at least 6 inches in length. So we go back to pine burr. We caught 400 bluegill. That's a good sample, 100 of which were at least 6 inches long. So 100 divided by 400 gives us a bluegill PSD of 25. And again, this will be included in some of the materials that Clint will post. But basically, what we want to do is look there on the left and you see bluegill PSD. Remember, it was 25. We're going to go up to about 25 there, not quite halfway between 20 and 40. And then across the bottom, you see on the x-axis, the bass PSD. We had a bass PSD of 45. And you basically look at where those two lines would intersect, coming across horizontally from the bluegill PSD and coming up vertically at 45. And where those two lines intersect, you'll see will be in that center cell. That is where your bass PSD is from 40 to 60, and your bluegill PSD at the same time is between 20 and 40. So that's where you want to be. In that tic-tac-toe chart, in those 9 cells represented, you want to be right there in the center. That means that your bass and bluegill populations are balanced. Release the 12 to 15 inch bass. Those are going to be your primary spawners. And you would hopefully also see that 1/4 to 1/3 of the bass you catch are also with at least 15 inches long. So if you're in that center cell, you're where you need to be for a balanced pond. If your PSD calculations fall in any of the other 8 cells you see represented, then it gives a recommendation there of what you might need to do. So angler catch records collected properly through fishing all types of lure sizes for largemouth bass and then collecting a bluegill sample and collect those total lengths off of the bluegill, that's powerful data for you to be able to manage a pond. Now there's a second index that we can use that addresses the plumpness of the fish you catch. Again, the analogy being everyone occasionally catches a bass that looks like a snake with fins. Well, we know what a bass should weigh at a given length. And so we want to use this actual weight that we'll collect the weight on of the fish that you catch against a standard weight that we know those fish should weigh at that given length. Now, what we want our sample to be is at least 95% of what that standard weight is. 95 to 100, somewhere in there. Fish populations that are in extremely good condition, sometimes the bass relative weight may be 110, 120 above what the standard is, and that means you're doing an excellent job in managing the habitat and the forage. But we're looking to be at least 95% of what that standard weight is. Now, we typically use it on bass because they're at the top of the food chain, but we can also use it on these other species as well. But it requires for us to take an accurate measurement of total length and an accurate weight of those fish that we collect in our sample. What we're wanting to do is make sure we've got adequate forage for all sizes of bass. Big bass need big forage, little bass need little forage. In fact, a bass can swallow a bluegill that's about 1/3 of its total length. So if you have a population of 12-inch bass and nothing but 6-inch and larger bluegill out there, your bass are literally starving to death because physically they can't swallow those 6-inch bluegill. So often we'll break down our bass population, for example, in 8 to 12-inch lengths, 12 to 15, and we'll calculate the relative weights, take an average within those different size ranges, because occasionally we'll have some relative weight problems for bass at certain lengths, which may mean that they don't have sufficient forage of a given length to keep them in good condition. Okay, you know, everybody had, back in the old days, a pair of those old rusty DeLire scales that weighed plus or minus 5 pounds. We don't have to worry about that now. You can buy a really, really good set of digital scales out there for 15, 20 bucks and keep them in the boat along with your measuring device, so there's no reason we can't be collecting accurate total lengths and total weights. So let's give you an example here. We went back to pine burr. We caught a 14-inch long bass, weighed 14 inches exactly, and it weighed 1.4 pounds. Well, the standard weight for a bass 14 inches long is 1.47 pounds, and again, there will be a standard relative weight standard weight chart in the materials that Clint will post on the website. So we make this calculation of dividing our actual weight by the standard weight, multiplying by 100, and in this case, the relative weight is 95.2. That's within the 95 to 100 range, and so we know that that's okay, but we don't want to make management recommendations based on a single fish. We want to collect numerous fish and make these calculations, and our relative weight tables are valid from about August through December. Okay, so these are fall caught fish. If we go in and try to use these tables for fish we catch this time of year, they're not going to be very accurate because the tables were developed for fall caught fish. So keep that in mind. So here's a graph showing the 95% line, and if we're 95% or higher above that line, then that's an indicator that your bass are in good condition, you've got good forage and habitat conditions. However, if you're below that line with relative weight, then you may have a situation where you've got bass overcrowding, you have a lack of forage and or potentially habitat problems, maybe too low of pH, maybe too muddy of water, maybe excessive aquatic vegetation. So this will give you a key to start looking for problems. I see relative weight calculations down in the low 70s occasionally on some lakes where they've got extreme water quality issues or perhaps no bluegill present for that bass population. So it's a real good tool to assess where you are with that existing bass population. Well, what do you do when your relative weight is out of whack? Well, think about the habitat, the visibility, think about the forage as I mentioned. Maybe we've got low relative weights only in certain size bass and we need to address that. Can we improve the carrying capacity through fertilization, feeding our forage fish, or perhaps aeration? And as I said, when you reach over a quarter to a third coverage of aquatic vegetation in a bass lake, you may have issues there of providing too much escape cover for the forage fish. So what are some tools for manipulating these fish populations? Well, fertilization, feeding, and pond aeration. Now we talked about feeding for catfish, but we can also supplement our bluegill by offering a floating fish ration. And by producing more pounds of bluegill through feeding, then those bluegill will support a larger population of bass. It's going to take about 8 to 10 pounds of bluegill to support 1 pound of bass. So if we double the pounds of bluegill that we can carry in our pond, we'll double the pounds of bass that can be supported by those bluegill. Fertilization, we have blends that come in liquid, powder, or granular. These days, I would recommend the water-soluble powders that have been out for about 10 years, very easy to use. Select one that's formulated for fish ponds. You simply open the bag, pour it in. Typically, the initial rate's about 8 to 10 pounds per surface acre, and then that will create a phytoplankton bloom, which is the base of the food chain, and correspond right up that food chain to your apex fish, which in this case would be the largemouth bass. Now, ponds that we may not want to fertilize are those ponds that are muddy, those ponds that have excessive aquatic vegetation, because the aquatic vegetation will compete with the phytoplankton for those nutrients. And if you've got a heavy exchange rate, you've got water running around the spillway constantly, you're going to lose that nutrient and that bloom of phytoplankton around the spillway. Again, this is where a bottom release drain pipe may help. If you're able to pull water off the bottom, you're maintaining that very rich, productive top 5 or 6 feet. Here is the aquatic food chain for you to take a look at. It just starts with some nutrient source, typically detritus, but we're gonna jump start that by using our fertilizer. Increase the phytoplankton, zooplankton insects, the forage fish, in our case bluegill, up to the largemouth bass, and you can see this is where it takes about 10 pounds of bluegill to support 1 pound of bass. We often use automatic feeders to supplement our bluegill. If you have catfish present in that multi-species lake, certainly they are going to use that resource as well. But I recommend if you're going to supplement your forage fish and or catfish, you need an automatic feeder for about every 10 surface acres of water. And you're going to want to start those this month and run them all the way up until the onset of cool weather when the fish basically stop accepting the ration. Now, supplemental stocking, we talked about if it's a bass pond and you don't have that Florida bass gene present, it's okay to go in. Typically, the worst thing you can do if you're having problems with your bass population is to go dump more bass in. If there's a limiting factor there preventing that existing bass population from performing like it should, the worst thing you could do is to put more bass in there and create more problems. So the only reason we typically stock additional bass on top of that existing bass population is to introduce that Florida gene. If you don't have catfish in that bass lake, but you desire to have some, certainly you can do that. It's okay to go in and supplementally stock blue or channel catfish into a bass lake. And the key here is to stock larger fingerlings. In the presence of adult bass, say 5 pounds and up, you're going to need to stock channel or blue catfish that are at least 8 inches long. And I would recommend that you look at a stocking strategy of 25 to 50 of those catfish per surface acre every 3 to 5 years. In the presence of bass and bluegill, your catfish will not be able to reproduce naturally because of predation on the eggs and fry. So if you want to maintain that channel or blue catfish population, you're going to have to restock on an ongoing basis, but use advanced fingerlings so you can avoid predation on smaller fingerlings. There's supplemental forage species. The bluegill cannot be replaced. It can be supplemented, but it can't be replaced. If it's a larger private lake, perhaps you want to build some nursery ponds adjacent to your main lake and raise your own forage species. It's not difficult to do. Let's look at some of these supplemental forages. As I said, bluegill's the foundation of our forage program, but we can supplement with species like threadfin shad, tilapia. We'll lose tilapia throughout much of the state when we get into cold weather in the winter, and they may have to be restocked annually. Avoid stocking hybrid sunfish. This is going to be a cross between a bluegill and a red ear, or bluegill and green sunfish, something like that. These hybrid sunfish, that F1 generation, about 95% of them will be males. And so you have such a skewed sex ratio, hybrid sunfish don't produce a lot of forage opportunities for your bass. So avoid stocking hybrid sunfish. Stock the bluegill, and where it's appropriate, particularly in East Texas, think about stocking the red ear sunfish, and then certainly threadfin shad, tilapia, or other supplemental species you can stock. If you've got adult bass present, that lake's already been there for several years. There's no reason for you to dump fathead minnows into that body of water. It's a waste of your money to do so. We only stock fathead minnows in catfish ponds where we stock just catfish to help give those catfish something else to eat, or when we initially stock a new or rotenome pond with bass fingerlings, we'll stock fathead minnows to jumpstart that bass population. Otherwise, you're wasting your money stocking that species. But again, go back and think. You want multiple sizes of forage for multiple sizes of bass. Small bass need small forage, big bass need big forage, so keep that in mind. Occasionally, we do have to do some corrective stocking strategies. Bass over harvested. This is the biggest problem that we have in our small bass lakes that we get in, and not bass over harvest, but bass under harvest. But occasionally you'll see over harvest, but in a private situation where you've got control of the angling pressure, this is seldom an issue. What I was about to address, the bass under harvested, this is a much wider problem. We see private impoundments, failure to harvest enough small bass on an ongoing basis, and we typically see situations where you can go in and catch almost an unlimited number of 8 to 12 inch bass, but seldom anything larger. Well, what's happened is there's severe competition for forage at that range of bass in that size, and so we need to reduce that competition by thinning that small bass population down by removing 20 to 25 per acre, and then that releases those remaining small bass to where there's less competition for the forage base, and they can grow larger. You may need to, on occasion, stock some larger bluegill, but again, that's very seldom that we have to do that once we've already got bluegill present. So, and here we show the proper way to measure your fish. mouth closed, tail compressed, getting a total length that you'll use for your PSD and your relative weight calculations. But keep records. Accurate total lengths and weights should be mandatory. And until you get some data established for your pond, just go ahead and put a 12 to 15 inch slot limit on bass. That is, all bass between 12 and 15 inches, throw them back until you collect enough angler catch data that you can start drawing some conclusions. If it's a new pond or a rotating pond that you've restocked with bass, don't take any bass out for 2 to 3 years until you see evidence of those bass reproducing. How will you see that evidence? Go through there with your small mesh Seine and start taking samples in the summer. You should see largemouth bass fingerlings show up as those bass are reproducing. Slot limits where we're protecting a degree of that bass size structure, that 12 to 15 inch, that only works if you're removing fish, particularly below that slot. And so we really need to put more pressure on our 8 to 12 inch bass in most of our private impoundments that just do not receive much fishing pressure. Watch your PSD and relative weight data. Those are your guides to let you know how to adjust your harvest regulations. Here again, we're tailoring your harvest regulations to your fish populations, but it's an evolution. It will change over time as you implement these harvest strategies, so that fish population should respond and change. Address habitat and forage fish issues along with managing your fish. Again, you can't manage just your fish. You have to manage that habitat as well. We have questions that people ask about attractors. Don't necessarily produce more fish, but they can shorten the time between bites by getting the angler and the fish together at the same place at the same time, and I'm all for that. I prefer brush lines rather than clumps that lead from shallow to deep water with some space, maybe 5 to 10 feet of space between those clumps to provide maximum edge, and those fish will orient at different depths along that cover throughout the course of the year and throughout the course of the day. So certainly attractors can help get you together with the fish that you've taken the time to produce. So I want to close with some pond management laws. We're a little over our time here, and I certainly appreciate you staying with us. But these are laws, and like the law of gravity, they're irrefutable. If you want more bass, grow more forage. If you want to grow 30 to 40 pounds of bass per surface acre in your bass lake, then you need to be producing 300 to 400 pounds of bluegill per surface acre in your bass lake. And remember, you've got to grow that trophy bass before you can catch her. Most all of our largemouth bass that are going to be over about 4 to 5 pounds in size are going to be females. And after an exhaustive study at Texas A&M University, we have found that if you fillet a 6-pound bass, she seldom has the opportunity to reach 8 pounds. So the nice thing is we can have the experience of catching that trophy bass, put that fish back, allow her to continue to grow, and provide a recreational experience for someone else or perhaps ourselves later down the road. All right, here's my take-home messages for you. Tackle your biggest problem first. You may want to buy Florida bass, but if you've got extremely acidic water, extremely muddy water, or your dam's leaking like a sieve, that's probably not going to be your priority. So tackle your biggest problem first and make sure you've got the appropriate habitat for the fish that you're wanting to raise. Take home message number 2. It's still legal to eat a largemouth bass in the state of Texas, believe it or not. And again, the biggest problem that we see in private impoundment management when it comes to largemouth bass populations is failure to remove enough of those 8 to 12 inch long largemouth bass throughout the course of the year. They overpopulate and stunt, too much competition for the forage, and so we need to be thinning these small bass down to allow those remaining to grow faster. So it's okay to fillet those small bass. Take my word for it, they're good to eat. Take-home message number 3, just because something seems like a good idea doesn't necessarily mean that it is one. Let's say your buddy calls you and says, well, I caught a bunch of crappie or caught a bunch of bass from Toledo Bend. I don't want to clean them. Can I come by and take them out of my live well and dump them in your pond? Well, that may sound like a good idea, but it's probably not, because you may cause imbalance between the forage fish and the predator fish, in this case the bass or the crappie in that pond. But you also run the risk of perhaps introducing a disease or parasite pathogen from those wild fish into your fish population. And finally, take-home message number 4, and this is going back to where we started. Quality fishing is the direct result of well-managed, balanced fish populations. Balance between the forage fish and the predator species, balance between the fish populations and the habitat. And if you don't believe that, this is more likely to occur. All right, we've come to the end. I'll turn it back over to you, Clint. I appreciate everyone tuning in today, and certainly if you want to review some of the materials or go back and view the webinar or certain parts of it, Clint will have that archived in the near future on the TWA website. Clint?
Most certainly will, and I appreciate that. I'm going to post up a couple links before we get to questions so y'all can jot them down, or probably be better to copy and paste them. But the first link is a Google Drive link that references most all of the files that Dr. Higginbotham was talking about. They'll be up there for a while. What I want to do is migrate those over to TWA's website. If you go to texas-wildlife.org and look under the resources tab, I'm going to get them put up there. But to do it in a hurry and make them easily accessible, they're going to be at that Google Drive link. The next link that I'm going to post is going to be the link that you can go back and watch this webinar. You can watch this webinar and all the other ones that we have archived. I'll get that up hopefully by next week, maybe by the end of this week. But if you want to go back and look at all of this information, it will be found there. So I want to jump into questions real quick. The first one is, how deep would you recommend a 1-acre bass pond be?
Well, you know, before 2011, I would say it was be shallower than what we need post 2011, because we had the drought hit here in rainfall-rich East Texas and lost some ponds that went dry that had never been dry before. Typically, I like for about 10 to 15, a third of the pond to be 10 to 15 foot deep, a third of it to be about 6 to 9 feet deep, and a third of it to be about 3 to 5, 6 feet deep. We don't need a lot of excessive water less than a couple feet in depth. The lay of the land, and to a great extent, will dictate the depth of the pond. But unless we have that bottom release drain pipe, when we get into a lot of water, much over 15 feet deep, that pond will stratify in the summer months, and that part of the pond will be lost to fish because it'll be so low in oxygen. Now, in many cases, we have to dig these ponds or maintain a lake deeper than what we need for fish production, and I understand that because of alternative uses like for irrigation and livestock watering. So you have to increase the volume of water that pond or lake will hold. But typically, if we can get 10 to 15 feet in depth, we're in pretty good shape to manage for most of our warm water fish species here in Texas.
Okay, referring to gypsum, do you recommend powder or pellets? Are they equally as good, or is one preferred over the other? And can you put too much?
With gypsum, I don't know that you can put too much. The other thing that gypsum will do is increase the hardness of the water. But we actually, on the A&M website, fisheries.tamu.edu, and Clint, you may want to post that. We actually have a fact sheet that tells you how to roughly calculate how much gypsum it will take to clear your pond. Now, the first thing I would do is take a 5-gallon bucket, just a plastic bucket, fill it with your pond water, and watch it for a day or two. If it hadn't cleared, then it is definitely colloidal clay that's in suspension. And those clay particles have a negative charge, and they just sit there and repel each other. Just take a handful of gypsum that you would buy from a nursery or garden center. Just take a handful, throw it in that 5-gallon bucket of water. If it hadn't cleared in a couple of days, stir it up and come back and check it later. If it is colloidal clay, that clay will have settled out. and be on the bottom of the bucket. So there you've shown that it can be cleared with gypsum. Then it's just a matter of calculating the rate that needs to be applied. And again, that Clearing Muddy Ponds fact sheet, and Clint, I will send that to you so you can include it with these other publications, will be your guide to calculating a rough amount of gypsum to add to facilitate clearing. I'm less concerned about over-treating with gypsum than I am some of the other clearing agents such as alum. There we can get into some issues, particularly in East Texas. But gypsum, seldom going to be a problem.
Okay, if you do have high turbidity water, would you estimate how long a largemouth bass can survive in those conditions?
Well, they can survive. They're just not going to prosper. You know, you're going to have some bass in very poor conditions. Let's say it's a situation where the pond had some clarity and then something perhaps out of your control up in the watershed led to erosion, maybe across property lines, and then your pond is muddied up. Basically, you've killed that food chain that we talked about that develops with the phytoplankton, the zooplankton, and so forth, because you're getting zero light penetration into that water column. Over time, that bass population is just going to stagnate because it's an unproductive system. Now, are there some things you can do to offset that? Well, perhaps number one would be to address that issue and stop that erosion if at all possible, so you can clear that lake back to the point to where the food chain is operational. But if nothing else in that scenario, I would at least try to supplement my bluegill. Since you're not able to fertilize with the muddy water, I would at least use a supplemental feeding program on my bluegill to try to promote growth of the bluegill population, which in turn will help the growth of the bass population.
Okay, if you install a fountain in a larger pond, will that ensure good oxygen levels in the summer and keep water cooler? And how long should you run the water?
It depends on the fountain. Many of the fountains that are out there on the market are just strictly for aesthetics. But there are now a number of aeration products that are out there that never allow that pond to stratify in the summer months. That is, they create enough aeration, enough water movement that you never have that cooler, heavier layer on bottom with a warmer, lighter layer of water that's oxygenated on top. And the depth of that warmer, lighter oxygenated layer will vary in depth depending on the particular pond. But will any aeration device help to some degree? Yes. I mean, if it's spraying water up in the air, then it is adding aeration. Is it enough to offset an oxygen depletion? Well, that depends on the severity of what's causing the oxygen depletion, usually bacterial breakdown of organic matter during the hot summertime, sapping oxygen from the water. Look at some of the ratings on those ponds. Typically, the larger the pond, the more subject it's going to be to wind action, the less need for supplemental aeration. Where we tend to see the need for more aeration is on smaller bodies of water, and particularly those small ponds where you're stocking and managing a very large catfish population. Remember that 1,000 pound per acre production rate we talked about. Their oxygen supplementation may be more valuable. But as you get into the larger lakes or get into a more intensive strategy, we don't use aeration as often, but for the landowner that wants to remove as many limiting factors as possible, there are aeration devices out there that prevent that pond from ever stratifying in the summer, that make the entire water column available to fish 365 days of the year. If you're going to aerate, I would start probably in May prior to the ponds beginning to stratify, and I would carry that process through until about late September, October, depending on where you are geographically in the state, when the water starts cooling and starts destratifying. So if you wanted to look at a kind of a month period, that May through about September, October. Now, if you wanted to narrow it down on a daily basis, your lowest oxygen levels in your body of water are going to be at daylight, just prior to the sun rising and photosynthesis occurring. So if you wanted to narrow it down even more and maybe not run it 24 hours a day during that warmer season period, then I would just run it at night during the hours of darkness.
Okay, let's say a pond, or this person's pond was initially stocked in 2000 and then apparently again in 2012. The question is, do you need to introduce new bass occasionally to, I guess, reinvigorate the gene pool?
No. The only reason for stocking bass into that pond that you've stocked twice now is if you've decided your management goals, you want to try to produce a little bit larger bass, and you've never stocked Florida bass. Okay? And then you can go in and just make a stocking of 20 or 30 pure Florida bass fingerlings per acre, and they will cross with your bass that you've already got in there. Now, there is one exception to what I'm telling you, and let's say this is a lake that there's no holes barred, you're intensively managing, trying to grow trophy bass, and want to do everything you possibly can. Then what you can do, if you've already stocked Florida bass in there, and there may be native bass in there, is go in and every few years take a sample of those bass and have them checked genetically. And there's several labs around that offer that testing, and make sure that Florida gene is still present in that population. And then if that testing warrants that Florida gene is disappearing from that population and your goal is trophy bass production, in those cases you would want to go back in and stock those Florida bass. We have some lake owners doing that. On occasion they do check just to make sure that Florida bass gene is still in that population. But should you need to stock bass just to, in using their word, reinvigorate the bass population, that should not be necessary.
Okay, one last question we have. You mentioned turtles not being a bad problem. What about water snakes?
I'll go back to what I said earlier. The only two critters that I fear from a fish population standpoint in Texas are the double-crested cormorants, and on smaller ponds like catfish ponds, then the river otter comes into play where they occur. I'm not worried about water snakes. I'm not worried about turtles. I'm not worried about kingfishers, great blue herons. Yes, all of those species consume fish, but you have to look at it from a population standpoint. None of those species have an impact on your fish population. Yeah, they may eat a fish here or there, but they're having no impact on the fish. And depending on the turtle species, unless you've got snappers or soft shells, most of our red-eared turtles, the sliders that you see on the bank or on the logs, most of them are going to consume vegetation and have no impact on your fish population anyway. What they will do is be a nuisance because they develop a taste for that supplemental feed. Say it's a catfish pond or a pond that you're managing for bass but supplementing the bluegill and you're feeding. Yeah, they'll show up and eat the feed. And, you know, if they're a nuisance to you, certainly there are turtle trap plans that we have that you can reduce the population. But are turtles or snakes having an impact on your fish population? Absolutely not.
Okay. I think that wraps up our questions. Going to post real quick, Getting to Know Your Quails, our next webinar. Again, if you tuned in for quail today and you heard about fish, I appreciate you sticking around. But our next presentation will be on quail on May the 19th. Dr. Dale Rollins is going to be presenting that. And so I think that's it. I'm going to leave the webinar up for just a little while longer. Please grab that Google Drive link and also the link for the archived webinar so you can go back and get all this information once again. But Dr. Higginbotham, I really appreciate you helping us out this month. It was a wealth of information as always.
Thank you, Clint. And I will send that Clearing Muddy Ponds sheet to you so you can also post it up for that question.
Excellent. Excellent. I'll throw it on that link as well.
Thank you for hosting.
Absolutely. Talk to you soon.